My name is Song Runjie. I'm postgraduate student of Professor Lucy Gao, and at present my major is philosophy of technology. So the research I'm working on now is your theory, especially your study on the case of Japan, and that will be the focus of this interview.
Okay, very good. I'm Andrew Feenberg. I'm ready to answer your questions.
So the questions mainly can be divided into three parts. The first part concerning some basic theoretical constructions of your theory, and we will start with the first question. So the first question is, modernity is a recurring theme in your theoretical discussion. Would you consider it as a fundamental topic that indicates the macroscopic background of your critical theory of technology?
Yeah, I think that's right. Modernity is a category that, of course, is rather complex, and there are many different interpretations of what it means. Um, but it is, we do have a sense that something happened that changed the nature of civilization. And it's a radical departure from all earlier forms of civilization. And we call it modernity. And I'm mainly interested in the nature of this peculiar change in the way civilization is organized and the way it thinks about itself. And technology plays such a central role, and technical rationality plays such a central role in this modernity that that becomes the focus of my work.
Thank you. And the second question is for the strategy you took in tackling the problem of the relation between modernity and technology. You resorted to rational critique of rationality, and you concluded that modernity could be regarded as a distinguished form of rationality which has been shaped by modern technology. And I want to ask what the difference between rational critique of rationality and the rational critique of reason, which raised by Adorno. And does this difference imply that you are focusing on a different aspect of rationality and modernity?
No, no, I got rational critique of rationality from Adorno. It's just a different translation of his category. Um, and this is quite important because if there can be if modernity is basically a society that organizes its culture around rationality, then a rational critique of rationality or rational critique of reason amounts to a claim that there is another form of reason, the form which is the critical form, and that then also suggests the possibility of a different rationality and a different form of modernity based on that different form of rationality. So you understand the idea of a rational critique of rationality suggests it implies that there is not just one modernity. There's a modernity that is the object of the critique, and then there's another possible modernity that would be based on the kind of rationality that is deployed in the critique. So this, for me, this is extremely important because a lot of the discussion of modernity treats it as a single thing. And then, just as we say of feudalism, there's feudalism and there's, um, so of course there are some variations, but basically it's feudalism. Well, we need to think in terms of modernity also as different possible modernities. They're not all going to be identical. And it's that which interests me. That's what makes it interesting. If there's only one modernity and we've got it, just come to New York and you'll find it. or maybe today you'd have to come to Tokyo or Beijing. Uh, but if there's only one, then we are essentially trapped, historically trapped, and cannot hope for any fundamental change. And Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, these Frankfurt School thinkers, have shown us just what danger there lies in this form of modernity. So we really do need another one, a variation. And that's why a rational critique of modernity is so important. And that's what it implies.
So the rational critique of rationality implies, I want to say, a kind of multiple rationality. And
Yes.
the difference between rational critique of rationality and the rational critique of reason mostly is the problem of translation.
Yeah,
Therefore,
there's no real difference.
okay. So the third question is, in your writing, sometimes you did not distinguish the different types of modernity, for example, cultural modernity or social modernity. Also, you did not make the distinguish between um, modernity and modernization. Would it affect your analysis on modernity?
Well, modernity is a cultural system in the broadest sense of the term. It's a particular way of organizing the thought and action and institutions of a society. So you can't really, I mean, it's such a broad concept that you can't really worry about, is it social modernity, cultural modernity? It's the term refers to all these things at the same time. Modernization is the process of becoming modern, and so it presupposes that you're not. China in 1850 was not a modern society. It engaged a process of modernization, and now it's a modern society. So, um, so now, of course, there modernization also is a technical term in sociology because it's a whole field of modernization theory. And this is a theory that was elaborated after World War II as a kind of alternative to the communist ideas about industrialization and economic development. And I don't, I'm not interested in that theory. I'm not talking about that theory. Just use the term modernization in the most general sense to refer to the process of becoming modern, which
Uh,
could take many different forms. Think about China is, you know, from the history you learned in high school, that China was not a modern society in the old days. Most of the people were farmers who lived off the product of their land. There was an emperor and a
mm,
royal bureaucracy, an imperial bureaucracy that,
mm,
and there was a religious systems that were very important in organizing people's social life and their beliefs, and all of that has gradually been eroded by the development of capitalism first, and then communism, and the industrialization of China. And this process occurred over what 200-300 years, from the 18th century beginnings, when there was just a few people in the elites knew about what was going on in Europe, through all the horrible events of the 19th century, right? And then finally the development of modern China. So this is a process which is studied by historians and sociologists, and it's called modernization. The outcome is a modern society. That means a society that has the characteristic of modernity.
okay.
So that's the terminology.
Yes, thank you for your reply. Now we are entering the second part, so the questions concerning the case of Japan in your theory. So
Right.
the first question is, in your discussion of modernity, you repetitively elaborated on the case of Japan. So, what do you think makes the case of Japan so special compared with other cases you have discussed in your book? And what make it deserve further attention?
Well, uh, if you're interested in the idea that modernity is not just one thing and that it's exemplified by the societies we live in, but that it could be quite different, uh, then you need some evidence. You need some examples.
Yeah,
So where are you going to get them? Well, here's a problem. Colonization occurred all over the world and transformed many societies, modernized many societies on the model of European modernity, um, but rather ineffectively, not very successfully. There's Russia and China, which tried to create a radically different form of modernity called socialism, but the outcome is not very different.
yeah,
So, where are you going to find something really, really different? Well, I mean, there's really two ways to look. You can look to the future. You can say communist countries are on a path leading to a different modernity, or you can look to the past and say, let's find a society in which tradition has persisted through the modernization process and changed the direction of development of modernization in significant ways. So, in the Japanese case is the latter. It's a case where you see a very strong influence of tradition on the process of modernization and a conscious attempt to preserve certain traditional values throughout the process of modernization. And this is, um, for me, this was a kind of test case. You know, I could see here. I mean, if I went to some colonial country in Africa, I couldn't really understand what was going on in terms of a theory of modernity. It's a mix of things from the past and poorly organized imports from the West, and so I needed something much more uh, sort of, I don't know how to say it, much more integra, integral. And Japan is the only case. I mean, Japan is the first country to modernize
yeah,
outside the West, and it did so not as a colony. So it was not corrupted and altered by its colonial past. Its elites were not just uh, intermediaries with European colonizing uh, regimes and corporations, but were completely independent of Europe. They went there to study and find
mhm,
out what's going on, but they came back. They were their own thing. So they had a chance to make a society that preserved elements of their tradition. Now, note, all modern societies preserve elements of tradition.
yes,
There's right. There's no other way for it to work. I mean, people. That's the way people are. They are always bound by some sort of past that gives them a sense of what the world is. But that tradition has to be translated into modern terms. So, for example, some ideas about um, Christianity disappear as uh, they don't organize social life in European countries anymore the way they did in the Middle Ages. And yet there's still an influence of Christianity in the way people think, right? And that shows up in the institutions and so on. So you can trace the fact that these societies had a Christian past, even if they've become secular societies. And so similarly with China, it's obvious, right?
yeah,
Uh, of course, it's much closer to the surface in China because it's all so fast and recent. In the case of Japan, too, what you'd be looking for is ways in which some of the original cultural uh, um, heritage gets translated into modern terms. And so that is in fact what I've been trying to do in studying Japan, to understand its modernity in these terms.
Yes, and that was impressive because you draw inspirations and insights also from the traditional Japanese philosopher like Nishida Omiki, and
Yes.
that was really interesting. So thank you for your reply. And the second question is, what in the first place raised your interest in the question of modernity in Japan? And we all know that you worked in Japan for several years. Could you share this unique experience with us? And do you think what impacts this personal experience on your research on Japan?
Well, um, when I was a teenager, I was interested in foreign places. I did not want to be the frog at the bottom of the well, as they say in Japan. Um, and the two places that interested me were Japan and France. Japan, because it had a non dogmatic spiritual culture, very different from Western religions, which are dogmatic. Doctrine, they're based on doctrine. And that's not the case with Japanese religion. And I was also interested in France for the philosophical and literary culture that was very different, non positivistic, not pragmatic, uh, philosophical and literary culture. And so these were like the most alien places I could imagine coming from the United States. And I wanted to find the most alien places. So that was the source of my original interest. But when I started to study technology and modernity, then I realized that there was something special about Japan, namely that it had achieved modernization without being colonized. And so it had the best chance to become an independent alternative modernity of any of the countries in the world. And I started to read modern Japanese literature. I'd read traditional literature before, but in this modern Japanese literature is all about modernity. It's all about the problem of becoming modern. So writers like Tanizaki and Endo and their Kawabata, they're all concerned with this issue of what it means for Japan to make this transition. And also then I read some of the philosophy, and that was really interesting because these Japanese philosophers adopted the concepts and terminology of Western philosophy, but used it to create an independent philosophical tradition. And that tradition is very strange and interesting. It's quite different from what was going on in Europe at the time. And unfortunately, that tradition became entangled with Japanese imperialism. So at the end of the war, it lost influence. But it's still possible to read some of these authors and discover interesting things about um, a different way of thinking philosophically.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Did I answer the whole of your question? There were several parts. Oh yeah, you ask me also how living there? Yes, how living there. Well, I was thinking about that because I had your questions in advance, and I was trying to think, well, did something happen there that was different from what I might have expected? Not really, except for one thing. I was at the time doing a lot of photography,
Mhm.
and I loved doing photography in Tokyo. And so I made many photographs. Some of them are like one of them is hanging on the wall behind me. Um, so one of them is on the cover of the book.
I mean, the cover of your Japan book is your own photographic piece.
It's the photograph I made when I was living in
Yeah.
Japan. It shows a well for drinking, but it's a very typical Japanese object, traditional object. But I have also pictures of modern things too. So that,
I
but I can't really, I can't really explain what it meant to me to make these pictures, but it certainly had some influence on the way I thought about Japan and went about writing about it.
I've heard that you have taught in the University of Tokyo for a
Yes.
while. So what's the difference between you in a Japanese university and in a Western university?
The as from I taught for one summer at the University of Tokyo. I taught a graduate seminar that eventually turned into the book on Heidegger and Marcuse that I wrote. Um, from what I learned from my friends, the main difference between a Japanese and American university is that in a Japanese university, the professors spend all their time in meetings and have no time to do any work. Whereas in American universities, the professors try and avoid meetings so that they can do their work and are usually successful in avoiding most meetings. This is a big difference.
Interesting.
Of course, there may be many other more complicated differences that I wasn't able to that I didn't become aware of. I mean, one thing that I did learn that was interesting to me. I had a friend who joined the group that I was working with, and she was promised that she could travel to meetings and develop her career. But when one of the members of the group became too ill to work, she was told that she would have to stay home to help the group. And see, this is a Japanese way of thinking, right? You make your choice and then you're committed to the well-being of your comrades. But an American would say, I'm going to go to court and sue you if you don't let me do the things that we contracted for.
It's very different.
So very different, yes. So she was forced to conform, at least to some extent. I guess she managed some kind of deal, but whereas in an American situation, I don't think anyone would have had the nerve to violate the terms of the original contract. Uh, they would just have, done what they could to deal with the situation while respecting the agreement. So it tells you what's more important, the individual or the group.
Yes. So I will continue with the third question. So how would you evaluate your discussion of Japan's modernity in the whole picture of your theory? And what kind of contribution does it make?
Well, I think the important, when you talk about what is a rational critique of rationality,
Yeah.
it suggests the possibility of alternative rationalities. And I was looking for that in Japan, looking for an alternative, another way of being rational. You read the essay I wrote on Kawabata's novel Meijin, right? The one
Yes.
on the master of Go. The
Yes.
whole point of that essay was to talk about a different way of thinking about rationality that was prevalent in Japan in an earlier time, perhaps no longer today. It's not easy to be sure, but that it certainly was different uh, before World War II. And so what I discovered was that the strategic rationality that's involved in playing a game like the game of Go is always accompanied by other considerations, that other ways of, it's always contextualized somehow. And the contextualizations are what is different. The strategic rationality may be identical, but it never comes along alone. It's always contextualized. And the contextualization matters, right? Because, in other words, the notion of a purely strategic rationality is an abstraction. It's not something that you could really find like a peanut or a horse. It's an abstraction from a more complex whole that includes the contextual um, surround of that for the practice of that rationality. So when I was able to show that in this novel, two different ways of being rational appear. A traditional way, which is not inferior, it's not strategically inferior to the modern way. So that's so this interested me because a lot of the literature, for example, Endo writes in such a way that you can see the contrast between the modern and the traditional as a contrast between the rational and the irrational. And I didn't like that idea because if the traditional is irrational, if it has nothing to offer, then forget it. You know, we're best off becoming modern and forgetting. But I found in this story of Kawabata a way of talking about the rationality that's preserved, that's present in the tradition. And uh, so that's why this essay was so important for me in thinking about sort of a way out, an escape from the idea that there's only one modernity.
And I do think an analysis of this novel is so marvelous in your book. And I was fascinated by the discussion about this novel. And that's one of the reasons why I want to introduce these parts into my thesis. So I do think this novel uncovers different aspects of the process, how Japan encountered with the Western modernity. Um, so I'll continue with the second question concerning the problem of
Mhm.
Japan. And to some degree, I think you have partly answered this question. So when considering the case of Japan's development nowadays, do you think that it has promoted a different form of modernity, or the case is that it has made some difference in certain aspects, for example, some technological modifications or advancements, but the main structure of modernity remains unchanged? And to answer this question, what kind of research is required according to your understanding?
Well, this is a very difficult question because, of course, there are many traditional features of Japanese society that have not changed a great deal.
Mhm.
Um, I once, I once asked a whole family, 3 generations, what they thought about modernity and how they contrasted it with traditional Japanese ways. And everyone in the family said that the modern way was better than the old fashioned way. And the old grandma was the only one who hesitated. And she said, I think the modern way is better because sometimes you are able to say what you feel. A remarkable answer, huh?
Yeah.
So the way she was raised, you would never say what you feel because that would burden other people with your feelings. And why should they be burdened with your feelings? Um, you should be attending to them, not them to you. That's how she was raised. And now she says in modern Japan, she can sometimes mention how she feels to other people. Well, um, you can see very interesting transition there from one idea of the role, essentially a woman's role, right, and another. Many things, though, remain, and I'm sure that in her life, she's much more like a traditional Japanese woman than an American teenager. Um, so there's the food, right? There's clothing styles that are slightly different, and certainly kimono is very different from modern clothing. So there's, but these are all you can question whether these matter actually.
Yeah.
Aren't these superficial? What you need is something deeper if you're really going to talk about an alternative modernity or an independent contribution to modernity from another culture. And so that then means, I mean, there's something difficult to work out there. I mean, look at Japanese learned how to make pianos that are as good as Steinways, right? Motorcycles that are as good as BMWs and so on, cars that are as good as Fords. These are all imitative projects. So you can't really hope to find much in the artifacts that distinguishes them from Western artifacts. If you look at the labor process, though, and the management systems, they're quite different.
Yes.
And so there is something happening there which is different. It just doesn't show up in the artifact. Um, and but I did find one contribution that I thought could be attributed to Japanese uh, to Japan specifically, and that's miniaturization.
Yes, you have talked it in your book.
Yeah, I mean the first instance was perhaps the invention of the folding fan. The Chinese invented the fan, and the Japanese imported Chinese fans and figured out how to make them fold. So that was miniaturization, in the Middle Ages. Um, but the miniaturization of electronics is a really very significant contribution to world technology. And it seems to stem largely from a Japanese tradition of miniaturizing things, whether it's making small things aesthetically pleasing is part of that tradition that began long before um, modern times. And so, so that I thought that was a significant contribution to the fund of modern world culture, technical culture, stemming from a traditional source radically different from the Western tradition. And I imagine that you ask what kind of research could be done. I imagine that someone who was a serious student of uh, specific technologies could discover other contributions um, to the technical systems that prevail internationally that emerge out of Japan.